I'm representing consumers, or how consumers can support regeneration. And I want to start in the space of food is special. Walter touched on it earlier when he said, special because it affects everyone. We all eat, it's obvious. I have a fantastic collection of Highland knitwear. I think I might be the only consumer in the room in that market, unless anyone else wants to admit it. But I'm making an obvious point. We all consume food, we all eat. The other is, it doesn't stay as a garment on my body. We obviously put it inside us. We ingest food. So when we're thinking about consuming food, it's really a very special place. And the relationship we have with food is a very personal one. And I want to represent two ends of the spectrum of that relationship. So on the one hand, we have folk who I hear say, food is fuel. Food is functional. Food is a commodity in my life. And the other end of the spectrum where people identify with food. It is who they are. It's about their values, who they are as people. And if you take those two ends of the spectrum, I want you to imagine a bell curve. Yeah? That's the population of humanity from those two ends of the spectrum. So when we're talking about consumers helping regeneration, I want to start at one end of that bell curve. A very important group of consumers, you might even call them prosumers, because they are kind of quasi-producers, some of them. So how can they help? And I imagine a number of us are fairly familiar with this. So there are growers' markets, there are farmers' markets. There are going to a local butcher, going to an artisan shop retailer, going to a restaurant that serves local food. And what we're doing is ultimately condensing a long food chain and face-to-face. Trust is involved, a belief in locality, a belief in community. And that can be enabled by things like the Open Food Network, an online tool that helps matchmake nowadays. There were those who grow, so WA Community Gardens is an example of that, people in their own gardens. Even a window box can help people understand the effort it takes to grow food and the seasons. And meeting some of you at lunch, talking about things like open kitchens where people are learning to prepare and cook food and doing it with kids and the next generation. All these are ways to support regenerative agriculture, and are very powerful ways. And this first group of consumers, I think, that part of the bell curve, I would call them early adopters in marketing terminology, or innovators. And they're important to regenerative farmers. So for me, I've spoken to a few regenerative farmers, and the ones that I've spoken to are often what they would call midway. We're in transition. We've been doing it for a couple of years. We're in millions of dollars of debt, and our food maybe isn't quite perfect yet. And we need these kinds of consumers to go along the path with us, to give us the benefit of the doubt, to be in partnership for the long term, not just a quick transaction. Those are very important consumers. They're also really important from other consumers' point of view, not just farmers. What I mean by that, they show up. They are a medium. Other people see them. I've heard farmers in the regenerative space saying, if you look at the guy next to me, he looks over the fence and wonders what's going on there. What's going on with that farmer? They seem to be happier these days. I'd like to hear a little bit more. That happens with other people too. That family next door, they seem to be happier. What are they doing? They show up. We are a herding species. I will follow. I will follow, and that's what this curve is about. And I'm interested in the next group of consumers. So how can they support? Well, at the moment, to be honest, they can't, because they're not aware. So the next step is around awareness. And I'm really jealous of the photos we've just seen. I would have loved to have had them when I talk to some consumers who really aren't aware of regenerative agriculture. And I want to share a little bit of story about them in a minute. Sit. So I've been very fortunate. Back in April, I had a call from a colleague, French, and he was going to Brussels, and he was going to go and advise a group called the IPES, or the Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food, and they were holding a forum for policymakers for the European Union, for farmers, for consumers. and for other people involved in the food supply chain to figure out how the common agricultural policy in Europe should shift, how it should become more diversified. And I'm a bit of a Eurovision Song Contest fan, and I said, how about we introduce an Australian entry into your European debate? How about we bring some views from Australian consumers up there into Brussels? And so we held some focus groups in Perth in April with people off the street and thought, well, how do we explain regenerative agriculture to them? Because they're pretty unaware, they don't know about it. And I want to make a point, regenerative agriculture is not organic, it's not sustainable, it's not conservation agriculture. There's something different about that. And as a communicator, I'm going, what can this do? What kind of power does this have? Because I've got a bias. I want regenerative agriculture to grow. I don't want it to just be niche. I want to push it. I have a bias around climate change and action in that space. So we did some groups, and we brought some folk in their 20s, without families, young singles, very trendy folk, and some parents. And we started to unfold the story, and these are the kinds of people who shop at Aldi and Coles and Woolies. These are the kinds of people who feel time pressure in preparing food. These are the kinds of people who think that organic is privileged and is an investment beyond them. These are the kinds of people who, when they have kids, the whole thing just goes crazy. I prepare food for them as well, and the time pressure's there. These are the kinds of people who want to buy WA, if not, I'll buy Australian, because I don't want to buy from overseas because they might spray stuff on it. Yeah? So these are the kinds of folk we're talking with. And we started to unfold the story of regenerative agriculture using imagery, so things like mob grazing versus feedlot, things like a planned field versus regenerative field, and started to do visuals. The thing is, people get it. You know? There are a lot of facts in the room today, but there are some critical facts that shift people. And I want to share some of those. So we've explained glyphosate, very difficult to pronounce, glyphosate, and the impact of glyphosate. And the reaction is, okay, well, I clean my fruit and vegetables. But the guy just said it actually comes up through the plant. Oh yeah. I'm sure the government would regulate against that. You know, that couldn't happen here. Could it? Pause. Micronutrients and obesity. Oh, well, it's the size of the serve that causes obesity. And the fat and sugar content, isn't it? Micronutrients, that's interesting. Tell me more. So they lean in. Climate change. That's fossil fuels, that's industry, that's consumerism. And farting cows occasionally, if you want to talk about agriculture. That's it. Agriculture is the victim of industry because it pollutes our wonderful fields. Well, what about a third of global emissions comes from the food and agricultural system? Oh, okay. It's interesting. I've worked a lot in anti-tobacco communication, and you can tell people to fear cancer, and they still smoke. And all these things too, they go, whoa, that's new news, and it's very powerful. The difference is, though, if you then say to someone who smokes, and by the way, you can give up and we can help, and here's the support line, and other people have done it. If you bring the solution close to them, they will act, and they'll spread. And that, for me, is the secret about regenerative agriculture. The solution is there, and it is close to the new news that can shift people. And in our industry, we call these facts, bleep me facts, and holy beep numbers, because they have the power to shift how people think and feel. For me, regenerative agriculture doesn't just have one, it has a cluster of these facts. And if we get the narrative right, I think we can scale regenerative agriculture. And the key is to help people become aware. Thank you.
So, yes, following on from Ronnie, and just while Justin's getting my slides together, I sort of want to give some sort of closing remarks, I suppose, and some actions of what we can do, which sort of will fit really nicely with what Ronnie said. So this is really about actions that consumers to actually support their own diets and their diets of their family and their communities, and also think about food security when we're talking about this, and build that next to, I suppose, regenerative farming. Thanks, Justin. So we've seen a lot of this today. The problem is large and it's urgent. The heat waves that are going to come, the heat stressors, not only on our animals but our plants and on our people and on the planet. So we really need to be doing something about these. Those asthma thunderstorms we saw earlier, I think that was last year or this year, are again probably going to occur when the systems are changing as they are. And it's a staggering that 9 out of 10 people on the planet are breathing a level of polluted air. And also this overproduction, this overconsumption, and this looks pretty nasty. And this is particularly sad. This was an image from the film Albatross. I'm not sure if anybody saw it, but it really is about the poor birds that go and swoop down the oceans, pick up what they think is food, but it's plastic, essentially a lot of it, and they go back to Midway Island in the Pacific, feed their chicks, and then the chicks end up dying when they've gone and cut them open and had a look what's in their intestines. It's, toothbrushes, lighters, plastic tops, etc. Assuming that bird trusts that what's in the ocean is food, and it, a lot of it isn't anymore. So that's a problem, and this also reduces our human productivity. Thanks, Justin. So what can we do? Because it is a big problem, and when I travel, I think, oh my goodness, how in my little role at the university can I make a difference? And I think we're all trying to make a difference, and that's why we're all here. And these are just some simple things I want to talk through now. So reducing food miles. So that is about buying local food and maybe even growing your own food. And I did have a slide earlier that said about growing plants that are blue and purple because they attract bees and other insects that help with pollinisation. Reduce energy use, so again, trying to walk to the shops, cooking more. And the reason I encourage people to cook, and we'll talk about food literacy in a moment, is because then you know what goes into your food and you can plan that appropriately. Reducing food waste, so we can do that at a household level. We can take responsibility for that. And again, it's about planning those meals and also reducing our serve size, even though Ronnie said that there isn't, we've got to think about that. We don't need to consume as much as we get dished up in certain restaurants and fast food outlets, etc. We need less food, but also our microbiome, so the previous talk I've done, by having a more resistant starch in our diet, we can diversify our microbiome, which again, a more diverse microbiome leads to, an easier way to maintain a healthy weight, which is what I'm trying to say. So people who are overweight and possibly obese may have actually a more finite or a less diverse microbiome. Also about using up leftovers, reducing your total calorie intake, and actually composting leftovers is a way to use them and put that back into the, in worm farms, etc. Educating others is important, and also being a wise consumer. So starting young, teaching our children to cook. And when you do go to the shops, it's about sort of reading food labels, thinking about why you're buying what you're buying, and being a good food citizen. And this is sort of new language that we all need to be sharing about buying something for the right reasons, and really that political or ethical reasons why we're buying or not buying certain foods. And again, eating at home. I mean, it's great to eat out and support our local restaurateurs and entrepreneurs in that regard, but also by cooking a meal at home, sharing it with others in your communities, you're actually engaging more for the right reasons and sharing sort of your knowledge whilst you're eating. Food brings people together. Thanks. So improving your food literacy is probably the big take-home message for me today. And this map or little framework is by Vidgen and Gallagher. And Helen Vidgen is actually a health economist. So it's about planning and managing your food, about selecting, preparing and eating your food. And this has actually gone internationally, and many people are looking at this simple framework to structure cooking, structure curriculum in education, to actually encourage people to think about their food in a different way. So even just planning and managing, these are simple things, but it's about writing a shopping list, going to the shops, buying local, trying to reduce the way you use fuel to get to the shops and things like that. And this isn't always easy, especially if you live in regional WA. Yep. Also, when we get to the shops, it's about understanding food labels. And those 5 stars that we see, or this healthy star rating, is generally on processed foods. The higher the stars, the better it is for you, but it's processed. If we go back to shopping around the edge of the shopping centre, where you've got your veggies and your fruit, milk and deli down the back and breads around the side, don't go in the aisles, because that's where all the processed foods are. We would be a lot healthier. Next slide. Food safety. We need to encourage ourselves to use the right techniques and washing hands, etc. But also about preparing foods in a healthier way, steaming vegetables, maybe some more stir fries, grilling instead of deep frying foods, etc. And then lastly, eating with one another and sharing that knowledge with children. We're doing a lot of work in the early years settings in childcare centres, where we look at the food that's being fed to our children. Those first 1,000 days from pregnancy to age 2 are really key, and some of what is being fed to our young children is not good. So how do we work with the community to implement food literacy? Well, at ECU we've developed something called Refresh Ed, which is a website for teachers from K to 10 to have all of these resources about delivering nutrition education into the classrooms. And then we've also, on our snack website, which is supporting nutrition in Australian childcare, we've developed other tools for our early years educators and our cooks in kitchens for those centres to actually improve the nutrition understanding, knowledge, and get it into the curriculum when these children are sort of 1 and 2. And one of my PhD students, and this is quite frightening, has just done her PhD on body image in 2-year-olds. So it's starting really early. So you've got young children who don't want to play with other children because they are overweight or obese. So we've got problems all the way through. We need to lobby for a healthier food environment, thanks. And that really is about working with our local governments about what our food environment looks like. If it's a healthier food environment, then we're going to be more likely to be healthier ourselves. We've worked with the National Heart Foundation to build the healthy food button down there in the right-hand corner. Thanks, Justin. And that was with also Hassell and Edith Cowan University to encourage local planners, designers of suburbs, etc., to consider the built food environment and make it a healthy one. Let's stop putting a McDonald's right next door to a childcare centre, etc. So we need to turn this into this. Next slide, thanks. So we need to also get you to support some of the research we're doing. So if it is in your area, get involved. And we ran something called the Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities sort of planning day back in February of March the 1st. And from that, we're going off to conferences and basically telling individuals about the success of that. And that was a cross-sectorial sort of discussion with DIE and other regenerative farmers about how we can change or fix our broken food system. And then the work that we're doing then goes from, well, I'm not working just here yet, but I'm working with the regenerative farmers, and we're down the other end. See my freezer full of poo? So this is a -80 freezer. So when we get our stool samples in from people, and people are so happy to do that for me, it's amazing. And then we do things with those poo samples, and then we actually analyse them, as others have said, for the microbiome, and we also take blood samples and analyse that for the metabolites of the microbiome. So the bit in the middle is the food lab and us preparing food, but really what we're trying to study is that whole sort of concept. I know I'm out of time. The whole kind of concept all the way through. Next slide, Justin, speed it up. Benefits of research to health and nutrition are great. There are health benefits and there are also food security benefits. We need to be more food secure, and our communities need to be more food secure. And there's also social and educational benefits. So we need to also enhance our literacy of our children in schools, and that's really what we're key. It's key, and Edith Cowan is working on that. So there's some take-home things for your calls to action, talking to local government and getting them to get on board. town planners and designers, if you have a say, go to your local meetings and make them think about when they're retrofitting environments, your suburbs, what you want and what you don't want. Early years in schools and community, promote, say, Refresh Ed and our snack websites, and then the universities and other stakeholders need to be implementing more of the higher level, the global work that is going on, and there is more planning happening in that space that I'm hopefully going to be involved in. And if we do nothing by 2030, 1 in 2 will be malnourished. We'll have 3.28 billion people who are overweight or obese, more people with micronutrient deficiencies. And no country has managed to reverse either of these things. And climate change, if we keep going the way we're going, is only going to make this worse. Thanks very much.
I'd just like to make this comment as an overall summary before I make a few comments on policy. I've been to lots of workshops. Since my book came out, I've probably done, 70, 80 talks, including in some wonderful sessions over here. And this is one of the best days I've seen because we've got the full spectrum of thinking from health, regenerative farming right through. And I just think there's so much to digest, and I compliment Evelyn and all the others that have turned up. It's a really rich day that in a holistic fashion has covered the spectrum. And whatever you think about regenerative agriculture and other stuff, if you ignore some of the health and other issues, if we go away today without a lot of take-home messages, I'd be very surprised. So thanks, Evelyn and all the team. I was asked, and so I'm going to be both delicate and as brief as I can to make a few comments on policy. And I'll preface that with an experience I had. I was put on the International Wool Boards in the early 90s by Simon Crean when the wool industry had gone through a major collapse. I was instructed to be a change agent because I'd worked with Italian processors and knew the chain reasonably and the Merino game. And so I lasted 2 years, was kicked off for being a change agent, but that was all right. And that was because I was the first and I think the only wool grower that was put on those boards that hadn't come through agri-politics. And the end result of that was, having worked with international customers, I realised the collapse of the wool floor price scheme, a classic buffer stock scheme, destroyed half our international customers permanently overnight when stocks were written down over 50%. We'd encourage that risk through agri-political policy and the pressure on government. And I'm talking about a $20 billion disaster, which led to my book, because that's Australia's biggest business disaster that had been. No one had talked about it. And so I traced that, and a key factor in that major disaster that affected not just our international customers, but wool growers in peasant communities in Morocco or Greece or wherever, let alone Australian wool growers. A lot of it had been driven by ideology in agri-politics. And so coming to policy, therefore, you'll understand I've got scepticism there, but I'm not going to be black and white about it because we can't write it off. So I'll compare ourselves to America. For every politician in Washington, there's 1,000 lobbyists. Now they're different to us because it's the home of those big transnational multi-giants that I've spoken about. And those lobbyists are earning their keep because they're keeping those subsidies, etc., that I spoke about earlier. For example, that maintains that $350 billion profit flowing to the big end of town. So I can understand all that. And Australia's got that to much lesser extent. We don't have those big companies resident here. And I noticed the other day when Monsanto lost the court case, understandably, our National Farmers President said, no, well, look, don't worry about it, glyphosate's okay, we can continue. And she can say nothing else. So I can understand all that. So I guess what I'm getting at is, I think the people in this room, we're into an innovative new space that is challenging the ruling paradigm, which comes from Canberra as well. You know, the main prescription is neoliberal economic rationalism and growth. You know, we measure GDP, etc., which can include ecological disasters actually are factored into how we measure GDP. So it's a ludicrous measurement. So that's just an example of how this driving worldview is taking us into the Anthropocene, etc. So understandably, I do not see the policy that flows out of Canberra right down through departments as being the change vehicle, even though there's a lot of good people in those levels. I see it coming at lower levels. We've seen good examples of what's happening in universities. I've spoken to a number of Department of Ag people here today. And across the country, they don't all subscribe to the full-on, as Walter calls it, the moron approach to chemicals and fertilisers and stuff. Some of them love their soils and are biding their times, etc. Their time, etc. We've also heard from Kelvin, and I think Indigenous people could play a huge role here because they're coming from a different space. They're prime, I can't speak for them all, but I do work with close friends who are Indigenous. Their prime view always comes back to country and their deep love over 60,000 years of tradition. So, and to have initiatives like we've heard from Kelvin, I think that's a new space. I think what's happening here in the Great Southern with your food thing is another example of policy that's bottom-up driven that can be a real change agent factor. And you're lucky in having probably the leading agricultural minister in all the state governments who's now driving change as some of those department people are here. So I think our role, I'm not saying forget about Canberra and what's happening down, and our research institutions have been shrunk and people are getting more conservative. That's all understandable. I think we're seeing people like the Haggertys are doing a lot of the R&D bottom up. It's pressure from local communities to affect our councils and then up to the states. That's where I see the change coming, and we as individuals being the innovators. So that's probably enough for me on the policy and where change is going to come from. But I guess I come back to that underground insurgency. It's food, human health, regenerative farming, and like-minded people in departments and councils, and hopefully higher up the level that will align with us as we began the day, as the shit increasingly hits the fan, if you will excuse the metaphor. You know, climate change, the Anthropocene, as that pressure comes on, people are going to increasingly seek solutions, and many of them, of what we've heard today, that's where the solutions largely reside. So I'll conclude there, I think. Thanks, Evelyn, and pass it over to the questions.